We do not want anyone to underestimate this virus.
Really, at the moment, the focus is on trying to save as many lives as we possibly can.
I had to call an ambulance. I was that sick. He said, "You've probably got it, can't test you, go home and good luck."
I got a call informing me I was positive. They told me there would be an ambulance coming to pick me up in 15 minutes, and there was no choice. I had to get on that ambulance.
One of the most challenging things that any modeller can try to do is predict the impact of human behaviour. You just cannot reliably quantify what people will do.
Hey there, my name is Mark Fennell, stepping in for Jenny Brockie for a very different insight tonight. Coronavirus is a global threat unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. But how are different countries tackling it? And what can we learn here in Australia? Tonight, we're going to take you all around the world. But first, what has become the new epicentre of this crisis? The United States. COVID-19 kills a New Yorker around every 10 minutes. But one New Yorker to survive is Nadia Ackerman, and she joins us now. Nadia, thank you so much for talking to us today. When you were first ill a few weeks ago, can you describe what the symptoms initially presented as?
The first thing that happened was the fever, a really sore chest and a weird dry cough. And over a 17-day period, that it went into severe fatigue, the worst headaches I've ever had, vomiting, diarrhea, just the sickest I've ever been.
When did you first realise it probably was COVID-19 and you needed to see a doctor?
I fell sick on the 12th of March and I went to the doctor on the 13th. They kind of dismissed me. My fever was only 100 and they're only testing people if they were 103 or higher. He did check me out and then he said, "You've probably got it. I can't test you. Go home and self-isolate and good luck."
And when the doctor said that to you, what was going through your head?
I was pretty disappointed and I didn't realise that they had very limited number of tests. So basically they're only testing people if they can't breathe and if the temperature is 103.
And so how did you end up getting a test in the end?
I finally just had to call an ambulance. I was that sick and I went to the ER. My boyfriend was also in hospital at the same time and he had tested positive. So they tested me then.
When you got to the hospital, how long were you there for?
I was only there for like 12 hours. I was in the ER. Again, if you can breathe, they send you straight home.
And so, Nadia, where do you think you got the virus from?
I know where I got it. On the 10th of March, I stupidly went to an Australian event, actually. It was held by the Australian consulate and it was a dinner for about 100 Australians. Many people have come forward who have tested positive from that evening.
How do you think the US, the President, and specifically the state of New York has handled this crisis?
I think the problem is that everything started too late. We found out too late, we acted too late, and I just hope that, you know, we can sort of get the curve going down within the next month.
Why do you think there was such a delay in that, taking it seriously in the US?
I think it just seemed so far away. You know, it was in China and just the way that the president was talking about it was like not a big deal. It wasn't going to get to us. And, you know, this virus doesn't discriminate.
Right now we're seeing pictures of tent hospitals in Central Park, refrigerated trucks being used as morgues. What is the feeling like for you in New York at the moment? It's
pretty terrifying. I'm really grateful that I got sick early. That sounds kind of crazy, but, you know, I was lucky enough to be able to get into the hospital and get into the ER and get some help. But right now, you know, we're all sitting tight and everyone's staying home.
All right, Nadia, I'm going to bring in our experts now. We have Adam joining us from Canberra. Adam, you specialise in government responses to pandemics. What do you make of how the US responded to COVID-19?
Unfortunately, I think this is one case where we've seen a lack of political leadership being from the top, which has led to unintended or unnecessary delays in terms of implementing widespread testing and getting the country on a sufficient footing to respond to this threat.
It's also about how fast it's spread as well. Earlier I referred to it as the new epicentre of coronavirus. Why has it spread so fast in the US?
I think firstly, the testing regime wasn't introduced quickly enough, and that has allowed the virus to enter the United States and continue to spread at the community level, which has now obviously moved across the country. It's largely still concentrated in New York. That is the epicentre for the United States outbreak. But obviously we're seeing further and more cases popping up in various different states all across the country. So they have got quite a significant challenge ahead of them in being able to get this contained as quickly as possible.
We've also got Jody joining us here from Melbourne. Jody, you specialise in pandemic modelling, and you were actually part of the group of experts who around the country were advising the government on how to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. What do you make of how the US has responded to this?
Well, I think it does reflect some very important differences from Australia's response. Obviously, given our location in the world and our close links with China, we were very acutely aware of the threat of importing this infection. And also the testing and laboratory capacity and the public health response associated with that was activated very, very early and has continued and will continue throughout this response. So that ability to quickly detect, isolate cases and quarantine their contacts has been a really active part of Australia's strategy, as have a number of border restrictions and a pretty strict approach to repatriated Australians from high-risk areas from very early on in this response.
But at the same time, Jody, there's been pretty significant criticism at certain levels of Australian government that they didn't respond fast enough, specifically to the public health communication about self-isolating. What do you make of that criticism?
I think we've actually had a very consistent approach throughout, although obviously the specific information provided to the public has changed, as it has to health professionals, as new information's come to light. So we completely appreciate that changing information is challenging for everyone, but it has reflected the rapidly changing evidence. So we are actually in a very different position from the terrible scenarios that are unfolding in many parts of Europe and the US right now.
Do you think the efforts being made right now are going to change that curve, that insane curve that we've been watching over the last few days in the news?
Infections require contacts between people to spread. When we reduce those contacts, all infections reduce. And there's good evidence from countries that have implemented distancing, such as Hong Kong, that not only COVID-19 is suppressed, but also influenza. And that's not an infection that's targeted by the specific public health actions. So, logically, the number of new infections will reduce. The question is over what time frame and how quickly that can happen.
All right, we're going to take you to another country now, to Singapore, where the government have responded very, very fast to this virus. We're actually joined now by somebody who, I believe, Charles Peñal, you're in isolation right now. Tell me where you are.
I'm in isolation in a location called the Resort. It's not a hospital. It's where they move patients who are well and don't need medical care, but are still testing positive.
And you tested positive after a trip to London. Immediately after you got that positive result, what did they do with you?
So I got a call informing me I was positive, and they told me there would be an ambulance coming to pick me up in 15 minutes, and there was no choice. I had to get on that ambulance, and I was taken to the NCID, the National Centre for Infectious Diseases.
Right, and as that was happening, as you were bundled into that ambulance, what was going through your head?
To be honest, I was a little bit scared. Obviously, I didn't really know how bad this could get, so I was a little bit concerned. But everything I was seeing around me in terms of the management, the medical care, seemed so professional that put my mind at ease quite rapidly. Knowing
what we now know and seeing how the virus has moved throughout the rest of the world, do you feel like that was the right decision for the Singaporean authorities to make?
Yes, I think so. Singapore is a quite particular place in the sense that it's very densely populated, so a virus like this can spread devastatingly quickly. And so they'd had experience in the past with other viruses like SARS and MERS, and they were well prepared. They had a good plan to deal with the pandemic, and it's a very strict plan of really isolating and confining patients with no contact. I've been in isolation for the past 28 days now. The first 25 were at the NCID, where there were no visits, no deliveries. I was not allowed to step outside the room.
Do you know when you'll be allowed to go home?
So when I was in hospital, the rule was that if you tested negative twice in a row, 2 days in a row, and we were tested every day, then you would be allowed to go home. Now, in this new location, what's a little bit frustrating is that the information around that testing schedule and the testing rules seem to have shifted a little bit. So we're trying to get some clarification, but it seems that the 2 negative rule still stands. But in this new location, instead of being tested daily, like we were in hospital, we're being tested every 4 to 5 days. So that feels very long at this stage for me.
What's the one thing you've learned about yourself while being stuck in isolation?
You've got to take it one day at a time, and I'm pleasantly surprised that one can keep oneself entertained and occupied in the mind for that long. Yeah, it's a bit of a test of strength, but I see from around the world, in China, in the US, your other guests have really been quite inspiring and showing a lot of fortitude and fighting against this virus. So we're all in it together.
Of course, we know the virus first emerged in China, where the government acted very, very swiftly. And one of the doctors who was actually on the front line in Wuhan joins us now. Dr. Fan Junping in Wuhan, China. Most people watching this will only have seen news footage of what it's like. But for you as a doctor, when you're faced with a floor filled with coronavirus patients, what was that actually like?
Well, when we firstly arrived in Wuhan, it was kind of tough, just because we work in the ICU ward. The patients are so critically ill, and they come one by one. You have to use up all the mechanical ventilator, and you easily lose them. You feel quite frustrated at that time.
For you personally, what was the workload like? How many days were you working in a row?
Well, I have to say we are quite well organized. We work in a 3-day shift. You have to wear all full set of PPE and N95 mask. The second day you work night shifts, another 8 hours. The third day you got a 1 day free, and another 3-day shift later.
Were you worried about your own health at that point?
Well, I have to say another first time, because the transmission capacity and all the reports, I'm kind of worried. Also, my family was kind of worried. But later, you find yourself working in a very well-organized team, and there's no shortage of personal protection equipment, and also the knowledge of COVID-19 accumulates. The nervous kind of, you can get rid of the nervous.
Doctor, we're seeing news that the lockdown in Wuhan is gradually being lifted. Are you at all worried that the virus could make a resurgence?
Well, it's a good question. Right now, it's still not get rid of, the lockdown. But we haven't too many new cases right now, and it has been lasting for quite some time. Also, the government is quite alert about a possible recurrence, and everyone is accordance with all the policies. We are still very alert about the recurrence, and right now we are much more experienced than 2 months ago. So personally, I'm quite optimistic.
Doctor, what do you think China can teach countries like Australia and other countries around the world about how to deal with this virus?
I believe the first thing we have to share with everyone is you never want to underestimate the virus, just because its transmission capacity, the ratio of critical and severe cases, and also the possibility of overwhelmed healthcare system. We do not want anyone to underestimate this virus. Secondly, I would like to suggest well-coordinated and combined effort to overcome this, just because it has never been seen like this before. It's a brand new virus, and it's causing death. we really want the whole society, including the medical staff, to work together, stick together, and the whole world work in solidarity. Thirdly, I believe a lot of focus will be put on critically ill patients, just because they are the most difficult part. However, that is the last line. The first line is prevention. We want citizens to adopt self-distancing, do good personal hygiene, just to stop it, not to try to cure it.
Now, one of the countries that's been praised for how they've handled this outbreak is South Korea, where some health professionals have actually volunteered to put themselves on the front line, including our next guest, Sung-Yul Lee, who joins us now. Now, as I understand it, you volunteered specifically for the COVID-19 job, which is very impressive. Why?
Because first, when I first saw the recruitment of the nurse, I just volunteered without any hesitation, because I thought to keep my family safe is the key to the keeping our country peoples safe. So I came here.
Did you have any concerns for your own safety?
I did. After I volunteered here, I was quite worried about getting infected to COVID-19. So,
what sort of protective measures have you been using in South Korea?
We wear this. That's the hazmat suit. That's the level D hazmat suit, and we put the 2 gloves and that's the N95 mask, and the goggle is quite essential too.
When you first started seeing patients, what surprised you about the condition that they were in?
Actually, they were a lot worse than I thought. Someone has got about 70% of the oxygen saturation. That's quite very low. So all that we can do is give them more supplies of the O2 oxygen. So yeah, it was quite serious than I thought.
Once you saw the patients, did you have more concern for your safety than you did when you first volunteered?
Yeah, actually I did. When the patients cough and sneeze, I was like, oh, I really don't want to get infected. Yeah, I was quite concerned.
Just lastly, how did your family react when you went to go do this job?
They were like, why am I going there? They thought I was gonna get infected, but obviously, wearing the hazmat suits protects me. So,
how are you feeling now? Do you feel like you're beating it?
Yeah, we are all handling it well. I think we're being extra precautious when contacting with the patients. For me, yeah, I'm doing great.
Sung-Yul Lee, thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you.
We might bring our experts back in here. Adam, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they're all held up as fast-acting countries at tackling the spread of the virus. What kinds of contact tracking and tracking measures have the Singapore government in particular put in place to actually achieve that outcome that is being so lauded around the world?
So one of the key measures that the Singapore government had implemented was ensuring that the Ministry of Health worked very closely with the police to follow up patients that were testing positive, as well as then to conduct contact tracing, so identify those people that may have come into contact with them. They've also used a lot more software and social media technology. So WhatsApp was a platform that they launched in late January, whereas the Australian government, obviously, we've seen that implemented here in Australia in the last sort of 48 hours. So there's been a number of differences in the approach that Singapore has taken. They have the advantage, obviously, of having been through the SARS experience in 2003, and they've obviously learnt from that and put a number of additional measures in place as a result of that experience.
There's also use of things like tracking apps as well. Should we have been doing that sort of implementation earlier?
Well, Australia is a very different country in terms of our expectations around issues like civil liberties. So you may recall we couldn't agree in Australia to establish a national ID card. So if the government was to move very rapidly to try and implement a system of tracking like the Singapore government has done, it would obviously understandably raise concerns. And again, there's perhaps a greater willingness amongst the Singapore population because of their experience of SARS that those types of measures are needed. It's also important to note, obviously, our response has been quite different from Singapore as well, and that reflects the different nature of the cases that we're seeing here too.
How do our rates of testing compare to countries specifically like Singapore?
Well, this has obviously been one area which has attracted a fair amount of criticism, and the government has been at pains to stress that we've actually been conducting a much significant higher proportion of testing per capita. I think one of the biggest issues around this, which has confused people, is that the priority was obviously testing incoming travellers. That was where the source of infection was coming from, and so we wanted to make sure that we were picking up all of the cases that we possibly could. At the same time, we've been very mindful and keeping an eye on local community spread, and we've seen a small number of those cases now, and obviously those numbers are growing slightly, and that's really the cause for concern within the Australian context. So as a result of that, we're seeing the government now moving towards changing the criteria and implementing more widespread community testing.
Jodie, I might bring you in here. We're seeing these different countries have relative success. How have they done it? And are any of those strategies worth porting over here?
So I completely agree with Adam that countries like Singapore in particular, have incredibly strong public health and laboratory systems, and also these technological tracking and other solutions in place that have helped them to keep containment early. But even Singapore has struggled in the recent days with a rapid increase in imported cases, as we've seen the global epidemic take off, and have stepped up their measures accordingly. So all of us have had to continue to adapt to change. I think the overall principle of testing, of case isolation, of quarantine, all of these have been deployed through the Australian public health system with the strategies and processes and within the wider social arrangements that we have, and those do differ substantially in terms of what I think our society would have tolerated earlier on. But obviously, as all countries are seeing increases in infections, and we appreciate the seriousness, all of us are stepping into a space of social and behavioural constraints that we never would have envisaged.
Jodie, do you think we could be doing better?
I hear endless cries of more testing. I would reiterate that Australia has had one of the highest testing rates in the world. And I would also point out the fact that testing resources, like all of our medical and public health resources, are not infinite. It's not simply a matter of testing everybody in the community, because we simply cannot do that and we cannot sustain that. We have to be smart about how we use our resources.
That being said, Jodie, as we've been testing more, what have we learnt about our trajectory as a country?
Well, as we've been testing more, we've still had a very high negative rate. So the proportion of tests we're doing has still been low, which is encouraging. It shows that we are testing a lot. What we have to really take note of in the figures that are reported, and these are reported clearly on the Commonwealth website, is looking at the proportion of cases we've had that have come from overseas, the proportion of cases that have clearly been linked to other cases. So those are chains of transmission that have been found and effectively shut down. And then it's those other cases that have popped up, not expected, that are the ones that have the greatest potential to spread. So groups of modellers are working with those numbers, which are still very small, which makes them very hard to interpret, to understand where our local growth is going. And obviously, as we have implemented a succession of measures in recent weeks, how well those measures are working to limit spread.
Every night on the news we see splash numbers of confirmed cases. Do they give a true picture of what's happening with community transmission at the moment?
Well, like I say, particularly as we are in the final stages of returning Australians from all over the world and from cruise ships, and we've seen cruise ships in Australia that have regrettably, had outbreaks on board, we need to understand where those cases are coming from, because it's the ones acquired in Australia that are spreading in Australia that tell us about our own epidemic.
Have you been able to have a funeral for your father yet?
No, there is no funeral, there is no priest, church service, nothing. It's nothing we can do.
Vesna, thank you so much for joining us. Your father recently passed away overseas from COVID-19. We're very, very sorry for your loss, but I do know that you were really passionate about sharing your story, and so we appreciate you being here. When did you first realise that your father was unwell?
I was talking to my mom almost every day, and 11 of March, Retirement Village called her and they said, we are shutting down the village, please don't come anymore, and your husband have a high temperature, 40-degree temperature, we think it's pneumonia, so we will keep you informed what's the next step. So from that day on, my mom was informed every day what's happening, but it was worse and worse and worse till the point that he stopped eating, he stopped drinking the water, and 7 days later, I came back home from work, and a friend of my mom called me and she said, listen, Vesna, I really have sad news for you, be prepared. I was talking to the retirement village friend who worked there, and she told me that your father have maybe only tonight or tomorrow time to live, and they asked me to go pick up your mom, take her to the village so she can see him when he's still alive. So my mom went, they put the protective clothes, mask, gloves, everything. So she went there, but he was already in coma, closed eyes, couldn't talk, nothing. So she went home, and the next morning we have news, he passed away.
Vesna, your mother's in Germany, you can't see her. How is she coping?
Oh, she is really in a bad state, like isolated, 80 years old.
Have you been able to have a funeral for your father yet?
No, there is no funeral, there is no priest, church service, nothing. And as far as she's know, they cremate him and they keep his urn in some crematorium or funeral place and waiting for this to be over so that she can have maybe a little funeral, something. It's nothing we can do.
That must make grieving very hard and very strange for you.
It is. It's really, like, we knew he was 88 years old, and he was with dementia problems. I knew that, but I just didn't want for him to go in this way. Like, why my father, you know, out of everybody? You don't think it can happen to you, actually. So this is still like a dream because it's happening far away. But you know, every morning when you wake up, it's actually true, you know, he's gone, he passed away.
Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Mark.
Of course, there are huge ramifications for a range of people here in Australia. Hossein Tavasoli joins us now from Sydney. Now, Hossein, you're an international student here in Australia, originally from Iran. You had a ticket even to go back to see your family right after you finished your PhD. And then, Hossein, what happened?
Well, there was a bunch of uncertain news and worrying news about what's happening in Iran, and I was trying my best to submit my PhD on time. And 20th of March actually is Persian New Year. I was supposed to go to Iran and visit the family, especially for the New Year, and all the friends and families. And it was just right after I submitted my PhD, there was these rumors that probably the borders will be closed. And then, yeah, it happened and my trip is cancelled.
What have your family in Iran been telling you about what's going on there at the moment?
Well, yeah, they are actually, since this pandemic started, I asked them to remain at home, like especially my mom and my sister. Yeah, they were telling that it was not very serious at first. People were not taking it so serious, but just right after like few days and weeks, when the numbers got higher and the number of dead people, so people were more like considerate and kind of scared, and they all remained at home.
I understand you had a job lined up as a researcher in a laboratory here in Australia. What's happened with that job?
Basically, universities and research institutes, they are encouraging researchers to do work from remote, do remote working. But my job is actually kind of involving to be in the laboratory, and they are encouraging for now to not to be in the lab.
And financially,
as you know, financially, yes, it is so bad.
Yeah.
I have no idea how to cope with this. Yeah, I know some sort of arrangement is going on through the government and things, but I'm still not sure if there's any support for me as an international student or not.
Hossein, thank you so much. Best of luck, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
No problem. Thank you, Mark. Thanks.
Simone joins us now from Brisbane. Now, Simone, you're Italian. You're currently employed under a sponsored visa. How are you feeling about your job security at the moment?
Very uncertain. Being completely honest with you, Mark, the problem is I work in the aviation industry, and as we all know, the aviation industry has been the first industry being impacted by this virus. So we're still waiting what's going to happen with the employment opportunity as well as the government response on that.
And what would happen if you did lose your job?
See, that's the thing. With the visa that I have, I'm here because I have a job and I've been requested by my employer to be here, and the government gave me that particular visa. The way I see it is, if there is no job for me in here, my visa is not justified by the government. So I'm hoping that the government is going to take into this consideration the fact that, I've been working with this company for 1 year now, and I've been here for 8 years. But, we're just waiting. We can't do much at this stage.
And do you feel like the communication has been clear for you and other people in your situation?
I think not at this stage, being completely honest. And I reckon that's because the government needs to put attention first on major problems, like tackling, the situation with the virus in other sectors. I think it's going to come sooner or later, that communication for all of us waiting on visas.
Now, we're also joined by Valentina Gossetti in Sydney via Skype. Valentina is originally from Lombardy, which is one of the worst hit parts of Italy, and it's had a huge impact on how she's connecting with her family.
Gli ospedali poverini, i medici si stanno lavorando tante ore al giorno, sono stremati, ne sono morti tanti di medici adesso. E adesso bisogna vedere come va avanti la situazione, perché i 15 giorni, 20 giorni sono passati, ma qua non si vede la fine di stare in casa. Bisogna vedere ancora quanti giorni staremo in casa, non si sa.
E quelle canzoni dai balconi le avete fatte voi anche nel nostro paesino?
Dai balconi da noi non si canta più, perché abbiamo ci sono troppe persone malate, troppi morti, e la voglia di cantare sui balconi è un po' passata. In principio sembrava non era così la cosa così grave, si faceva, era bellissimo, specialmente per i bambini, per i giovani era una cosa bella, però adesso si sono un po' smorzate le acque, perché la gente è più triste. Speriamo che trovino la soluzione.
Speriamo che funzionino queste misure. Che ti faccio vedere il tuo Roberto. Di ciao alla nonna. Di ciao, baci alla nonna. Di baci alla nonna.
Ciao, bellissimo.
Valentina, your son Roberto was born 2 months ago. What has all this meant for your family?
Well, it's a very delicate time for our family. Thanks for having me, first of all. Because obviously one of my desires was to take him to Italy when he hit the 3 months mark. But now, obviously, we're not thinking about our own situation anymore, and we're thinking more about the global situation, and this will probably be impossible.
There's the global situation, but then there's also the experience for you as a mum. I mean, how does it feel not being able to see your own mum in a time like this?
It's very hard because obviously my mom is also a widow. I don't know whether you knew that. So it was really important for me to share this moment with her. And as a international family, is always difficult with this kind of things. But this is particularly delicate for us, and it causes a lot of pain not being able to freely travel around. On the other hand, sometimes I almost feel very, very selfish when I think that people are going through much worse things than this personal experience. But I would be lying if I told you that it is easy to think about the fact that I won't be able to go there whenever I want to bring the baby to his country.
Adam, I might bring you back in here. Adam, we've heard about the Italian situation, the German situation. They have the oldest and the second oldest populations in Europe, and yet their pandemics actually seem quite different in how they're playing out. Why are those trajectories so different?
The short answer is we don't really know just at the moment. There are obviously some key differences between these two countries. So Italy has a higher proportion of older people. So the mean average age there is 68 years, where in Germany it's 46. We've also seen that Germany has implemented much more widespread testing throughout the community than what Italy has. And unfortunately, particularly for Italy, one of the key issues that we saw there is that there was widespread community transmission, which has led to such a massive number of cases, and we're seeing the tip of the iceberg with the very severe illness that we've witnessed as well. But there may also be other factors, such as the higher rates of smoking, intergenerational living circumstances, and other sort of geographical and population density factors. But all of that will be investigated, obviously, in the aftermath as to why we've seen such huge variation. Really, at the moment, the focus is on trying to save as many lives as we possibly can.
How do those two countries, Italy and Germany, demographically compare to, say, a nation like the UK, the United Kingdom?
Italy, their average age is 68 years, and the point has been made that the UK has got an average age of 64 years. So there's also concern that the UK may see a similar trajectory to England as well, which is why the government there has enacted such stringent measures and effectively locked down the country for at least a 3-week period.
So density and age are considerable factors. Earlier we also heard about Iran. Do we have a clear picture of how the pandemic is playing out there?
Not as well as what we've seen in some other countries, and population density and geography are only two factors that will influence disease transmission dynamics. So there are just multiple factors that can come into play here, and obviously social distancing is one of the key interventions that we can see implemented to try and prevent that rate of transmission continuing to spike.
Jodie, based on the evidence provided, does Australia's trajectory look more like Italy or does it look more like Germany to you?
Look, I think it's very difficult to say, and Adam's raised a number of the issues that make understanding severity in those countries very different. Obviously, we've implemented stringent behavioural measures early. We're nowhere like the situation of implementing them in response to a crisis. But the other thing that makes it really hard to understand disease severity is that even the measures that we can gather about hospital rates and admission to ICU and deaths and all of these things also have to be interpreted in the context of the system stress. So clearly a health system that is overwhelmed will not be able to admit as many people. That means that the death rates will be higher because people aren't admitted, but also, you know, that in very crowded ward settings and where ventilators are limited, really difficult decisions have to be made. So we've tried very hard to interpret what we can understand about disease severity from a whole range of different country contexts, but we really have to take into account the settings in which those measures are taken.
Jodie, is it possible to predict how the strategy for Australia will evolve over the next couple of weeks? Can you already see the markers of things we're going to have to change? Because the last few weeks have been marked by constant changing messages about how we should behave, both as residents and international travellers. Can you predict what is going to happen over the next couple of weeks?
So I can predict the measures that are going to stay in place, and that's the very active case finding and the very strict case isolation and quarantine measures. In terms of the behavioural measures that have been imposed, those have been ramped up quite quickly already, and many states like Victoria are already effectively in lockdown. So the difficulty is that because there is a delay from actually catching the infection to turning up with symptoms to potentially progressing to severe outcomes, we don't see the impact of those measures on newly reported infections for at least 7 to 14 days. So it's very difficult right now to say what a measure imposed 2 days ago, or it's impossible to say what a measure imposed 2 days ago has done, and we're only just starting to see how effective earlier measures have been. But the other challenge is that we rely on our populations to actually comply with them for them to be effective. So part of the issue there has been to try to improve compliance.
Jodie, we've talked about density and age and size of population. What are the variables that we don't talk about enough?
So I think there are some quite Obviously, there's been a plethora of modelling out there, and we've been involved working through a range of scenarios with Australian governments. Models aren't magical. They're ways of thinking logically through the consequences of things. But one of the most challenging things that any modeller can try to do is predict the impact of human behaviour. So we can, estimate how well we think something like imposing social measures can work. We can estimate how well quarantine and isolation might work, but we require on people to comply with those measures. So we can run forward projections of how well we think these interventions might operate. We can set targets for how well they would need to be working to achieve our overall goals of flattening the curve and limiting that trajectory, but we just cannot reliably quantify what people will do.
You're part of the team that has been advising the government in their strategy. What has surprised you about how Australians have responded to this?
I think at government level, Australia has taken this very seriously for a very long time, and that's been evident in measures that have been imposed all the way through, including those border measures and other measures. And I think at the time the society thought we were overreacting. There was a lot of criticism of some of those measures early on. So I think overall there's been a very strong focus nationally on reviewing the evidence, updating the evidence, applying that evidence. The public has come on board over time, particularly as we've seen outbreaks in Europe and the US. I think those have really resonated clearly with the Australian public. But it's been a journey for all of us to be able to comprehend the magnitude of this crisis and what it is that we're going to need to do to get through it.
And Adam, for you, what has surprised you about the way Australians have reacted?
I think one of the issues obviously has been that aspect of the messaging and getting the message through to people that they really needed to take this seriously much earlier on. We're seeing much better levels of compliance with social distancing now. I'm sitting in a park and I've been watching and observing people interacting here, and people are definitely behaving in the way that they need to. What we've seen more broadly, which is continuing to be of concern, is obviously the younger generations, the people in the age group from 20 to 29, which are continuing to serve as vectors of the transmission of this virus.
Adam, New Zealand locked down a lot harder than Australia with far fewer cases. What do you think of that strategy?
What I would say at the moment is I don't think New Zealand's lockdown is going to be long enough. Once you implement these types of measures, they really need to be in place for an extended period of time. If we accept that there's a household of, say, even 4 people and you've got an incubation period of up to 14 days, you can understand that a 3-week period may not cover that entire household. So Australia has taken a different approach. We have focused much more on a scalable, flexible model or approach to dealing with this pandemic, which is based on our pandemic plans. New Zealand has also got the benefit, I guess. It's a much smaller country, a lot less population. So they're hoping that these measures on a short-term basis will be effective. But personally, I suspect that they're probably going to find that the measures are going to have to be continued to be extended, like we've seen in other countries elsewhere.
I needed to say hi to her, so I waved out on my balcony. She waved back. I asked her out to dinner, but she said how. I had to do some thinking. 5 p.m. hits. It was time for our date. Wait, where is she? Just kidding. We follow the rules.
My friends were shocked, absolutely mortified, horrified. A lot of them thought perhaps I had a bit of daddy issues.
I checked my social media and went, oh my God, Aretha's died? And he said, oh, really? Aretha who? And I said, oh, Aretha Franklin? And he went, oh, is she a friend of yours?
I looked out my window and saw this girl dancing, perhaps to a TikTok song. I needed to say hi to her, so I waved out on my balcony. She waved back. I grabbed my tape, pen, drone, and paper. Then I wrote down my digits and sealed it on my drone. Flirting is normally daunting for me, but since I've been quarantined in my apartment for a week now, I was craving some social interaction. 2020 has been off to a terrible start, but I still needed to shoot my shot. She picked up my drone, and I guess it worked because I got a text from her an hour later. I asked her out to dinner, but she said how. I had to do some thinking. But first, I needed to freshen up, so I shaved, brushed, flossed, and did a couple push-ups. The barbershop is closed, so I cut my own hair. Next up was finding the perfect fit. Okay, this one. 5 p.m. hits. It was time for our date. Wait, where is she? Just kidding. We follow the rules. I waved out on the balcony. She waved back. I told her she looked beautiful.
You look beautiful!
So we got on FaceTime and ate our matching organic microwavable dinners together. I sneakily coordinated with her roommate earlier to set it up. The date was going so well. Depending on how long this quarantine lasts, I might be in a long-distance relationship with someone who lives across the street from me.
Yes, coronavirus has had all kinds of strange impacts on human behaviour, and that man, Jeremy Cohen, joins us now from Brooklyn. What prompted you to ask her out on the date the first time, Jeremy?
Well, hi from the other side of the world. Yeah, I mean, I've been cooped up in my apartment all alone because of the situation, and I was craving some human interaction. I'm a very outgoing person, and I wanted to talk to someone.
And how long have you been in isolation for so far?
It's been about, I think today's day 15 or 16.
Judging by the video, I think I know the answer to this, but how would you say you're coping?
So far, so good. I mean, I'm making the best of it every day. You know, I'm trying to see the silver lining in the situation.
So far you've been on 2 dates, both in social isolation. This is what you did for your second date.
It's time for my boldest move yet. I hope she doesn't burst my bubble. I needed to see her, but I also wanted to respect the fact that we should be social distancing. I crossed the street and texted Tori to come outside and look to the left. I think she liked it. I brought flowers and hand sanitizer, but that was a misstep considering I was locked inside this bubble.
How on earth do you get a bubble sent to you? More importantly, is there going to be a third date?
There is going to be a third date. I need to figure out how to one-up it. I have some ideas brewing, but I'm not sure yet. I'm just a romantic, and I want to be creative about it. While also practicing social distancing. I want to get as close to the line without crossing it.
More seriously, though, how worried are you right now?
You know, it's definitely scary times. I have friends that are affected by it. I mean, everyone is affected by it, but I really believe that even though it's a very strange and scary time, we don't have to be sad all the time. It's okay to feel sad, but we should also be able to feel some happiness here and there, a little distraction here and there. So this is just a way of distracting.
How long do you reckon you'll be able to get away with isolation dating for?
Well, yeah, I mean, with FaceTime and texting, I'm pretty good right now. But it would be nice to go on an actual date sometime in the future.
Jeremy, thanks so much. We should make ISO dating a term, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Thanks, Jeremy. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Jodie, how long do you think we're going to be dealing with these restrictions that we're currently living through?
That's an excellent question, and one of my most annoying answers is that our measure of success will be how long this epidemic spreads out, because that's the way that we can sustain the ability to treat cases. One of the challenges faced globally is what the exit strategy looks like. We've moved quite quickly to very extreme measures here, really quite marked social restrictions, and we are all eyes on China, on Hubei, as they ease their restrictions, to understand how we can safely back away and allow people and society to function more safely over the longer term, because this is not a short game. And as Adam rightly points out, those who had the initial strategy that we can go hard on this for 4 to 6 weeks and then resume our normal lives totally missed the point about the fact that this is a globally established virus that will inevitably return.
Adam, do you think Wuhan waited long enough?
That's a really good question, and I think the proof will be really in the pudding as we start to see those measures being relaxed. There's already been concerns that China has not been as forthright and transparent in reporting the number of asymptomatic cases that they have documented, and obviously there is concern about ongoing rates of transmission. And if I could just pick up on that last question as well, I think it's really important that Australians appreciate we're in this for the long term. We can get the outbreak in Australia under control, but it also is entirely contingent on what happens in the rest of the world. And while we've got countries that have got ongoing rates of transmission at high levels, there is the continued risk that the virus would be reintroduced into Australia even after we have these measures in place and after we've seen the rates of transmission decreased here. So this really is a change in our lifestyle, and we need to come to grips with that and realise and appreciate that we're in it for the long haul.
Do you think people can sustain it, Adam?
I think it is going to be a challenge. Obviously, you know, we've enjoyed a particular freedom in our lifestyle, how we move around, what we do, how we interact socially, and that has to change at the moment now. And those changes, once they come into effect, they need to be maintained for an extended period of time. We can't afford to have the virus start to flare up again and circulate in parts of the community, even once we have this under control. So we're going to need people to maintain that high level of compliance with social distancing measures for an extended period of time.
Jodie, how do you think this is going to change us this next 6, 12, 18 months? How are we going to look at the end of this?
I really can't say. I think we all have had a dramatic wake-up call about the way we've lived our lives and the degree of global freedom and movement that we've had, and we've seen some of the consequences of that. I'm a mother of 2 teenagers. It's a really bad time not to be able to see your friends when you're that age. It's not enough to be with mum and dad. So we're all trying to work with them and support them to stay engaged and connected. I think we're going to be much more creative, like your friend in New York, about how to do that, how to care for each other, how to look after each other, how to make each other laugh in really challenging times. And I personally, I'm so grateful for the camaraderie of my colleagues and my friends and my social supports and the way we can keep doing that in different times just to show each other that we care for each other. Hopefully that will be something positive that some of us will take away from this.
Jodie, Adam, thank you both for talking to us tonight. And thank you for joining us. For all the latest coronavirus facts in 63 languages, you can head to sbs.com.au/coronavirus. I'll be back at 10 p.m. with the feed. Tonight we have some incredible stories of hope that have come from this crisis. But right now, Dateline takes you inside the world of chocolate. Good night.